Such a pleasure seeing you, Rabbi Edelstein. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Katzin.
I am sure that many of our students, our community, would like to know more about you. It takes a leader to create leaders. And probably one of the most important things we can dream about is following your footsteps. So I'd like to know more about your background, about your journey, and how you became a leader.
Okay. I think you're going to be disappointed in how I became something that you're accusing me of, that I'm not sure whether I am. But let's just see what the autobiographical sketch looks like. So shall I begin at the beginning? I come from a small town in South Africa called Welkom, which is 200 miles south of Johannesburg. Now, when you say to an American, you want to say somebody's really from way out there, you might say that he's from Des Moines, Iowa. But at least people have heard of Des Moines, Iowa. When I tell South Africans that I'm from Welkom, they look at me puzzled. Most of them never heard of it. And some have heard of it, haven't a clue where it is. So we're talking about way out, all right, as far out as one can go. We had an average of 60 families, 60 Jewish families in this gold mining town. And my memories of the town are dust storms, tremors from the gold mines, mine dumps, and there were no traffic lights in that town. Everything was traffic circles, not a single traffic light. So these big, huge roundabouts. That's my memory of the town. But the Jewish community was amazing because although we were not religious, except for the rabbi, who wasn't even a rabbi, he was a reverend. He'd done 2 years of yeshiva study, and they awarded him the title of reverend after 2 years. We were, yet the only synagogue in town was Orthodox, and we had a deep sense of responsibility towards maintaining that synagogue. So, for example, there was prayer services every night, and there was a rotation. But we were not committed to praying every day, but we understood there had to be a minyan every day. So, there was Tuesday night was my night, and after my bar mitzvah, Tuesday and Thursday, whatever it was. And if ever somebody didn't show up, they'd get on the phone and they'd call somebody and he'd come right over. He'd close his store and he'd come over. The synagogue had to come on, had to run. We all went to synagogue on Friday night. We drove, but we went. We all went to synagogue Saturday morning. We might not have prayed. We might have just sat in the back and talked, but we went. That's what you did. There was a tremendous sense that as Jews, we do everything together and we do everything. So we did all of this, and youth movement on Sunday, and there was Hebrew Judaic classes during the week after school a few times a week, which we all went to. Nobody was ever left out. If we went to play a soccer match, for example, on Sunday, we would ride around on our bicycles and pick every Jew up. There wasn't anybody who was ever left out. And that was an amazing thing. You knew you were Jewish. You knew exactly, you had no questions about your Jewish identity. The question was how Jewish you're going to be, right, one day. But that was actually a very good, strong background. So even though I went there were no Jewish day schools in those days. In fact, for 2 years, I went to Christian Brothers College, a Catholic school, because it just happened to be the best school in town. I began my school career going to a bilingual English Afrikaans school where shoes were not compulsory, just to give an idea of how out of town this was. And then when I turned 13, that's when my journey began, really. Up until then, it was all just presumed. When I was 13, so we all dropped out of, we called it Cheder, Talmud Torah, afternoon Hebrew class, school. But I wanted to carry on for reasons that aren't clear to me. I just did, and I was the only one who wanted to carry on. So this reverend said, sure, I'll teach you. You come, you'll be the post-bar mitzvah class. My mother said, I'm not letting you go to Hebrew class on your own. I'm going to come with you. So my mother joined me, right? The two of us went to we were the post-bar mitzvah class. For 3 years, that's what we did. I'd go to Christian Brothers College in the morning, the Catholic school, with all these Irish brothers teaching me, Brother O'Neill and Brother McGreevy and Brother McNulty. And I'd go to this. And again, I didn't become religious, but I did start wearing tefillin. I became religious, Rabbi Katzin, over about 12 years. And that's how long from the beginning of this journey, bar mitzvah. Well, it was a little bit less. Bar mitzvah until 21 is when I started keeping the Sabbath. And it was a long journey, so it wasn't an overnight thing. It was 9 years, to be accurate, until I started keeping Shabbat on a full-time basis. However, when we used to go to a secular youth camp called Abonim, there were 1,200 people in this camp at the end of the year from all over the country. There were 4 people who put on tefillin in the morning out of those 1,200. 600 were females, right? I was one of those 4, right? And I don't know, didn't feel I was religious, but I just felt tefillin is something that I do. And I've laid tefillin since my bar mitzvah. Then at 15, my parents decided they got to give me a bit of more of a Jewish education, and they sent me to a boarding school in Johannesburg, it's like a secular Zionist Jewish day school called King David. And that's when I first started learning Gemara, not as a part of the syllabus in the school. There was no Gemara in the school Talmud. I had to get up early, and interestingly enough, again, there were 4 of us. 2 who were observant from outside of the school grounds. We stayed in a big hostel. We were the out-of-towners, and 2 from inside of this hostel. And so I've been learning Gemara since I was 15, but I wasn't religious yet. I was doing all these things. I'm going to fast track. There's a lot of stories to tell during that time, but let me fast track. In South Africa, everybody had to go to the army if you had a white skin. This was the time of apartheid, when the whites ruled everybody else. And if you had a white skin, you went to the army. You had no choice. So after I finished school, I went to the army, and I went to like a tough unit, a very, very tough unit. It was the engineering 13th Tweefield, the 12th Engineering Regiment, it was called. It landed out that there was only one other Jew in my unit. There was 2 Jews. There was no anti-Semitism during the year. In fact, the captain warned everybody at the beginning of the year. There was a Jew who died the previous year in a campaign against what they were calling the terrorists on the border. It's a complicated thing, but at any rate, there was no anti-Semitism. I never felt that. But I became 2 things happened with me in the army. One, I landed out in a leadership role. I landed out coordinating in the beginning, when the basic training took place, there were many more Jews who all got transferred out after the basic training. I landed out coordinating our ability to go to the synagogue on Friday night. There was a rabbi used to come and give us a lesson once a week, as everybody would divide. It was called Church Parade, and they would say everybody would gather, and then they'd call by church. So you gather in your bungalow, and then they'd say Anglicans. They'd say it in Afrikaans, right? Right dress, and the Anglicans would march off. Presbyterians. Right, Dutch Reformed Church, and they go through all the churches, and everybody would march off. And then the Jews were lost, and there'd be a Jew standing here, and a Jew here, and a Jew here on this big parade ground. And then they'd say, Yoda, Jews, and we'd march off, and we'd go have our lesson. And then we went to synagogue on Friday night, and then on Sunday, when they went to church, we peeled potatoes and did guard duty. So there was a clear understanding that the Jews, they got their day off, and they helped everybody else to get their day off. But besides that leadership role that I had responsibility for, I'd already had responsibility in this Jewish day school that I'm skipping. Something happened that was very vitally important to my decision to become observant, because what I saw was how people react when they are under immense pressure, when they're living in a pressure cooker. Okay, when what I saw was that I saw how values broke down. For example, if you hung your laundry on the line, you had to chain it, right? You had to chain your shirt at this end and at that end to the line. Otherwise, it wouldn't be there when you're going back. All right. If, sometimes there'd be people lining up for food and the first few people would take 5 times the portion and the people at the back wouldn't get food. There were many, many things where I saw the decline over the year of the moral sensitivities of the people that I was with. So there was something extra that's very important here. It wasn't just that people's morality was declining, but along with it, they were creating the logic, the justification, the justificatory ideology, if you like to go with it. They didn't just simply say, well, I'm going to steal this guy's shirt. They'd say, somebody stole from me something, or somebody stole my shirt from me, because it was a problem. If you were missing your kit, they wouldn't let you out on weekends until you bought new stuff, and you were getting paid pittance. You'd have to save up for months in order to do that. So if you lost yours, then you'd be tempted to steal somebody else's. They would say, it's right for me to steal from somebody else because somebody stole from me. And I would say to them, how's that right? He's not the guy who stole from you. And they couldn't understand it because their minds had changed, all right, over the year. They'd learned how to justify their actions. And I could give you so many examples of that decline. So the amazing thing was that if we got a weekend out, the moment they stepped out of their camp, boom, they changed back to being their good old selves. It was like the Jekyll and Hyde. They weren't the same people. All right, those rough and tough and rude and immoral people became cultured, right, and kind and gentle the moment they got out. But I knew that the moment they go back into the environment, it'd be like a switch and they go back. Okay, but I said to myself like this. It was a very hard year. I said to myself like this. I said, you know what? Next year I'm going to go to college. These people, some of them that were in the army, they were very, very not educated. For a white to be not educated in South Africa, they were at the top of the pyramid, was very unusual. So one of them was he was a stoker in the tug. He used to stoke the fire in a tug in Cape Town Harbor. And he made very sure I understood that he worked for the engineer, not for the captain, with pride. Another one was a packer of fish into the freezers of Cape Town Harbor. I'd never met people who, were lacking so much in education because whites were privileged in South Africa. So I said, you know what? These are rough and tough guys. Next year, you'll go to college. There'll be a college educated person. It'll be a cultured person. It'll be a different story. So I got to college. And to my surprise, I saw the same thing in disguise, in a different form. What I saw was instead of stealing shirts off the line, I saw people in South Africa, we used to call it jippo. They would take a coin with a hole in it, and they'd hold it. In those days, the telephones were coin operated, and they would put it in, and then they'd yank it out, and then they'd be able to have a free call. Or the same with the laundry. Instead of waking you up with their boots when they came off guard duty at 3 o'clock in the morning, they'd wake you up with stereo music, much more cultured. And I kept on saying, to myself, if these guys would be in the army, they would be the same kind of animals, right, as the people that I met. They're just in a much more comfortable environment, but they're actually doing the same thing in a more sophisticated form. And that was a wake-up call for me. It was a wake-up call that there has to be a morality that is universal for all times and all places. It can't be that it's dependent on the environment. The environment is so triggering of behavior that can so quickly descend into chaos, that there has to be that thing. Now, being that I'm a little bit on the intellectual side, I never did any formal courses of philosophy at university, but I did a lot of my own studying of philosophy, even at a high school level. And I started looking at the biographies of the philosophers, especially the ones that I was impressed with what they said. And I was totally shocked. I could not find one philosopher that I could say, this is a role model for me. This is how I would like to live my life. You know, Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who I so admired in terms of his ideas, turned out that he had 12 illegitimate children, and he put them into an orphanage which had an 80% mortality rate, which means they were almost certainly going to die. You know, the most horrible things. You know, Kant, who was just the super genius, Immanuel Kant, turned out he never got married, and he was, you know, a loner. He wasn't very social. You know, he basically was a mind, right? He was nothing more than a mind, right? And one after the other, I was just very, very disappointed. At the same time, I started going for Shabbat to families. And now I was saying, okay, you guys, it's very nice. You're having this nice Shabbat dinner. How would you be in the army, right? So simultaneous with that, I started doing Holocaust studies to see how religious people reacted during the Holocaust. And I was just, the army is a party compared to the Holocaust. And I was just so amazed at how so many observant people managed to maintain their standards and not have any kind of moral decline, and share their food and sacrifice themselves for issues. I began to suspect that this was a system that was really working, right? Viewing the families and viewing. So, and besides which, I was having a lot of personal satisfaction from these Shabbats. In the meantime, I became the chairman of the South African Union of Jewish Students, and we used to come to Israel at conferences, World Union of Jewish Students, and play politics. It was a lot of fun. But besides that, I started on our campus a Friday night service, which lasted certainly for many years afterwards. I went to one of the dormitory heads of dormitories, and I persuaded them to lend us their dining room on a Friday night. I went to various different communities in Johannesburg. Now remember, I wasn't from Johannesburg. I didn't know these people, and persuaded them. I persuaded Chabad to give us challahs, and this one to give us this food and that. Right? And every Friday we'd collect the food, and we made our own Shabbases. Okay. We didn't have a rabbi or anything. We just figured it out ourselves. Eventually there was a kind of a young guy who was a little bit older than us. He must have been about 26, and he used to walk in from the community, which was quite a walk, and help us with the services. But basically it was a do-it-yourself student service. So by the end of that year, I was not eating kosher food, right? I was eating the food in the dormitory. But I was starting to eat my milk dessert, right? My treif non-kosher milk dessert before my treif non-kosher meat main dish, right? So I wouldn't be eating milk after meat. I'd be eating it before. That was a kind of like contradiction that I was living, but I felt it was progress. But at the end of that year, I started keeping Shabbos. I remember the last Shabbos that I did not keep. The story goes like this. There was an Israeli girl. That Israeli girl is married today with a fine Torah family living in Beit Shemesh. But she was in South Africa for a number of years, and I'd somehow met her. And often we would go out to the same family for Shabbat. And she said to me, come for Shabbat. Well, I'm going to here and here. Come, we'll have a great time. And I said, no, I'm not coming this week. I said, there's a international squash tournament, the sport squash. I used to love watching it. I want to watch the squash team, the squash tournament. So she went, I stayed, I watched the squash tournament. She came back. I said, how was it? She was glowing. She said, I had the most amazing time. And as she was talking and I saw this glowing spiritual face, I said to myself, Edelstein, you are such an idiot. You watched this stupid blah squash tournament. What did it give you? All right. You know, people hitting a ball against a wall. All right. And you missed out on the most amazing experience because of your stupid, idiotic stubbornness. Right. So there was a rabbi who's now living in England, and I asked to speak to him, and I talked it out. And the next Shabbat, I started keeping Shabbat from then onwards. Towards the end of my first year, then I had to move out to the residence, and I found a family, and it was a whole big thing. But I didn't wear a kippah. So when did I start wearing a kippah, a yarmulke on my head? That was too big a step for me. I was, in those days on our campus, there were maybe 5 people on a big campus who were wearing kippahs. It was a very unusual thing. There were very few Orthodox Jews in South Africa in those days. Today, there are thousands. I went to Israel on a leadership training trip. Today, Olami has all kinds of leaders, but there was no Olami, there was no, right? This was under the auspices of the Jewish Agency. And because I was the chairman of the South African Union of Jewish Students, I was a student leader, I was eligible to go on this trip. And it was a real thing. We met Golda Meir, we met all kinds of, she wasn't prime minister then, she was retired. But they gave us, access to top people. And during that trip, it was just very natural for me to keep my kippah on. It was like Israel. It was my second time in Israel. The first time was as a part of this King David school to go on an Ulpan, and we ended out being there during the Yom Kippur War, 1973 war. So that was an experience. And this was my return. When I got back, so I got on the plane and my kippah was still on my head. I just, like it was just there. But when I was getting off the plane, I was very, very aware of the fact that now I have to make a decision. Do I keep this thing on or do I take it off? All right. And it was a moment that was more difficult than my decision to keep Shabbat. Shabbat was obvious to me. All right. Keeping a kippah on my, advertising the fact that that was hard. Okay, it was a private thing, Don't ask me what I do on Saturday, I do my thing. But yeah, in your face, right? So I decided to keep it on. Okay. When was the most difficult moment for me? There was this guy I knew, psychology professor. I did a double major in psychology and industrial sociology. Don't ask me what industrial sociology is. I don't know. I just know I majored in it. And so there was a psychology professor who was Jewish and secular and who knew me. And I remember so clearly, I was sitting on the stairs of what's called the Social Sciences building, which is where the psychology department was. And I was speaking to somebody and he was walking to go up the stairs to go to his office. And I knew that he would see that I'm wearing a kippah. And in my mind, he was like a super sophisticated guy. Like, I was in awe of him, right? But he was secular. And I kept on saying, what's he going to think? What's he going to think? He's going to think I've gone off the deep end. Like, what, and you can imagine the moment, and he's walking and then he walks past, and okay, he didn't say anything. It was too high quality a person to say anything. But after that moment, that was the moment of truth for me, right? After that moment, I felt completely comfortable, not only being observant, but being open about it. Okay. So by that time in college, by the time I finished in college, my day was divided into 3. I used to study a little bit. BA wasn't very challenging. the undergraduate degree. And even though I did a double major to try and make it a bit more challenging, it wasn't, right? It was so, and then I had my student leadership activities. And then I was studying, yeshiva studying, I wasn't in yeshiva, but I was studying various texts in South Africa at that time. You could have private rabbis teaching you. There were so many resources available, and that's more or less what happened with me. And I was studying quite a few hours a day. When we finished, there was a yeshiva that started in South Africa, which I helped to start. Which means I took responsibility for. They asked me whether I'd join it, and I said, well, I only joined it if it's a proper yeshiva. It's got to be a yeshiva. There's got to be dorms. There's got to be, right. And they opened up a yeshiva which lasted for 1 year, and then its success was its downfall because we all left to go to Israel. We all graduated out of that yeshiva. Now, at that time, my chavruta ended up being somebody by the name of Akiva Tatz, who became a famous outreach rabbi. It's my claim to fame that I studied with Akiva Tatz. How did I become the head of Neve? I said, oh, you studied with Akiva Tatz. Why don't you run Neve? Now, Akiva Tatz had not been to the army because he was a doctor. And he did medicine because then he could go in as an officer under much easier terms. So 6 months into our studying, he had to go to the army for 2 years. I needed a year. He had to do 2 years. There was nobody else for me to study with at that stage there. Nobody quite that, combination of being a beginner, but somebody who could already learn Gemara, Rashi, Tosfos already, was. So I left and I went to Israel. And to cut a long story short, by the end of the first year, I'd met my wife, who was from New York. It was an intermarriage. A South African country boy. If you would have asked me when I'm growing up, would you ever marry somebody from New York? I said, well, what are you, crazy? I mean, it's not possible. Where am I going to meet such a person? And why would she be interested in me? I'm a country bumpkin, who barely knows how to put shoes on. To this day, I'm just amazed. But that's what happened. I married this girl from New York, from the Upper West Side. As it happened, her parents, her father in particular, had become a Baal Tshuva through Shlomo Carlebach. My wife was the babysitter of the late Shlomo Carlebach's kids. Well, not such kids today. At any rate, we got married, and I was learning at that stage in Kollel. I learned full-time for the next 8 years. Our first kid was born, and one day I took him to the babysitter, and he cried because my wife was working, and I cried. And I went home to my wife. I said, look, I said, this isn't working. You've got to bring our kids up. I don't want a babysitter bringing our kids up. And she agreed 100%. I said, I'll work. Don't worry about it. So I looked around for a job, and the job that I was about to take was to open up a dry cleaning place, and I would sweep it out, and until I'd go early, and then until the owner came, and then I'd go to work. But just before I took that job, I got a job teaching Hebrew in Or Sameach. Now, they forgot to ask me whether I speak Hebrew, so it was a kind of a learning on the job type of a thing. But it was in my lunch break, and I was learning in Kollel and Torah Or, and if I took the bus, there was not enough time. So I had to ride it by bicycle. If I took a cab, I wouldn't have the money, right? I would use up all, it wouldn't even be enough what I was earning to pay for the cab. So I used to ride. And I got myself a golf suit, so rain, hail, or snow, I rode on my bike, no matter what the weather, to Or Sameach taught the Ulpan and came back. One thing led to another, and my first real job was at Osamac as director of outreach. It's a job that was created for me when I went in, and when I left, they closed it. No more director of outreach, whatever the job was. My second job was which I had for about, must have been 20 years, but it overlapped with something else, which I'll tell you about, was as the executive director of the Heritage House, Rabbi Meir Schuster's organization. What happened was the major donor had asked me for a report on this Heritage House. I had a lot to do with it because of my job in Osamac. And I wrote a report, but I said, look, it's a fantastic place, but Rabbi Meir Schuster is not an administrator, all right? He's not a director, he's a kiruv person, and therefore it's badly run. And as a courtesy, I showed it to Rabbi Schuster Zatzal before, and he was so, all I can say is sad, you know, like he was very upset with me. And today I'm very upset with myself. And then he came back to me, and this is the greatest of the man, and he said, okay. 4 days later, he came back to me. He says, why don't you do the job? You say this is needed, you do it. So I said, great idea. And I left Osamac and I went to work for the Heritage House. And for the next 20 years, I went into the Old City every day. As a part of the Heritage House, myself and Rabbi Abramov and Rabbi Resson, we started a thing called the Heritage House Kiruv Training Seminar, which was to train couples to go out into the field. By the end of the year, it became so big, we spun it off into a different organization called Ne'ele Elef. Ne'ele Elef at this stage has put out thousands of couples all around the world. And I was one of the directors, the active directors of Ne'ele Elef. And under Ne'ele Elef, we started a thing called Olami. In those days, it wasn't called Olami. All right, the first name it had was Morasha Olami, and I became, by default, the CEO of Olami for 10 years. Why by default? Because it happened to be that Mr. Aaron Wilson was in a hotel together with Mr. Eli Horn, and the only other two people present was Rabbi Abramov and myself. And Mr. Eli Horn had just floated his company, Sorella, and he went overnight from being a multimillionaire to being a multi-billionaire. I remember in the olden days when Mr. Zev Wilson used to send me to go and pitch Mr. Eli Horn on projects, Mr. Eli Horn would say, tell Mr. Wilson that when I have 10% of his money, okay, I will give 90% to this project. All right, but at that stage, they were kind of like equalizing in their funds, and they did a mega deal to start this Morasha Olami. So there was nobody, they didn't appoint anybody to do it. The next day I came back with a proposal of how to do it, and Aaron Wilson said to me, no, we're not going to start hiring and doing a whole infrastructure. As you need people, we'll take them on, go get started. So I just happened to be standing in the hotel at the time. So that's how I became the CEO. I did it for 10 years. It wasn't sustainable for me. And I was enjoying it less and less because I was running things. I was overseeing budgets and targets and organizations, but I wasn't dealing with nurturing people, which is what I really love to do. So at some stage, I stood down. Rabbi Menachem Deutsch took my place. I stayed on in Olami as the executive mentor of Olami, a position I hold to this day. And then came this call to run Neve Yerushalayim. And again, I don't know how it happened, but clearly the Olami job wasn't going to be enough for me for a whole day. And I was on the lookout, and there were 8 different organizations that I was looking at to become the CEO of them. Neve wasn't on the list. If there would have been 20 organizations, Neve wouldn't have been on the list. I remember very clearly Rabbi Yonah Ari Revson, the son of Rabbi David Revson, who's the overreaching dean of all of the Neve institutions, contacted me and he said, I need to speak to you. So I knew him and I said, okay, I remember clearly it was a Wednesday. I said, how about next Monday, this and this time? You know, oh, busy guy. So he said, no, I need to speak to you now. So, okay, come right over. So he came over and he said, my father's in LA, but he wants to offer you the job to run Neve Yerushalayim. I was like so left field. But my instant reaction was to jump and to say, I like this. I said, I have 3 conditions. 2 conditions were fulfilled on the spot. The third took a bit of investigation. It was a condition that their finances be in order. And off I went into this Neve position. That's where I am to this day. Most of what's happened in my life, I believe, is a function of 2 things. One, the fact that they happened, I just lucked out. I mean, I'm a country boy who's, you know, I don't know what I should be doing. I should be picking corn, you know, in a maize field, which is what surrounded me when I was young. I don't know how I lucked out, so to speak, right? God was very kind to me to lead me in these directions. But the other thing, my part of that was whenever an opportunity presented itself, I jumped. Okay, I jumped. I didn't hesitate. I made some of the biggest decisions in my life, most of them, very quickly. And I didn't make them quickly because I'm a hasty person. I made them quickly because they were clear. They were clear. And the only thing that told me not to be hasty was, how could you make such a big decision so quickly? But there was nothing to talk about. They were absolutely clear that I should do it. So that's how I landed out in these things. As far as leadership is concerned, all I can say is like this. You might say that leaders, right, create visions and they create causes. I believe that the opposite is true. I believe that causes and needs and visions create leaders. I don't know whether I'm a leader or not, but all I know is that whenever there was something that needed to be done, if nobody else was doing it, you know, so there wasn't a choice. I got up and I did it. That's how I became the CEO of Olami. That's how many things in my life happened. It was something that just was clear. It had to be done. It could be done. I could do it. So I just felt there was no other choice. This is what I had to do. And that's my story. Of course, I left out all the interesting and juicy bits.
What a story, Rabbi. First of all, tremendous thanks to you for sharing. And my first reaction, of course, that probably the easiest and fastest decision I ever made is taking over age. I did it like with a blink of an eye when Rabbi Takarsky reached out to me to help. Yeah. And I said, it's the most important outreach organization in the world. It cannot stop. So that's what I did. Another probably important decision I made is actually opening a Sinai Academy high school that I was running for 30 plus years. And it reminded me that when the Jewish people were accepting Torah, we said, Na'aseh v'nishma. We said, just do it, right? And then we'll figure it out. So it probably means that we make decisions, first of all, emotionally. Of course, we rationalize, but when we feel clarity in our hearts, and it aligns with our mission, then the choices are clear.
Yes.
Another secret I wanted to share with our viewers is that I want to express my gratitude to you for not only creating the strategy of our organization and welcoming our students and taking care of them in Neve Yerushalayim now, and visiting us and speaking to our students over the years, and actually even traveling to Moscow and being very involved with the Moscow Russian Jewish community, but also with being a personal mentor to me. So my tremendous gratitude to you for your guidance. And I do have many questions, but maybe one question, okay? From many questions, I just want to ask you one, because you said that the events create leaders and not vice versa. In other words, the challenges that inspire people to, right, stand up or make this decision and either run away or accept the challenge. That's what makes the leader. So it requires a sensitivity of the heart and feeling the pain of another person. So overall, living in South Africa, so I'm asking double question. Living in South Africa as a Jew, did you feel, so to speak, the pain of apartheid, the black community? Did you feel it? Because I know that so many Jews like were fighting for equal rights, similarly to like human rights here in America. And then when did you feel the pain of the Jewish people? Because you would not dedicate your life unless you would see the cause. So what was the cause that inspired you to take the leadership position? So one is like general situation. How did you feel as a Jew in South Africa? And then how you felt as a South African Jew who moved to Israel and now dedicates himself to sharing his Jewish soul and Jewish knowledge with others. And you wrote a book guiding others, and you guided and instructed so many, I would say a generation through your organization, Ner Le'elef, correct? It was a generation of educators that actually share your vision, and they're all over the world, especially in the English world, the English-speaking world. So what was that cause in the Jewish world that inspired you?
Okay. I was tremendously bothered by apartheid. We like everybody else, we had servants. We had a female black servant for the domestic, for inside the house, and then there was a gardener who would come, who spoke. We had no common language with him. He was what we call a migrant laborer on the mines, and he used to work in the garden. And this maid, if you'd throw your pajamas on the floor, she'd pick them up and fold them, and I hated that. Right? I used to make my own bed. I hated being waited on by her. When I was in college, I expressed this in two ways. One, I took on 2 black students to teach them English for their matriculation, for their school leaving certificate, because English was not their home language. And it was quite a daring thing to do, because you presumed that you were, you might have been watched and whatever it was. But I also, as a student leader, I was invited to all the national, South Africa is a very well organized Jewish community, so they had national organizations. So there was a Jewish Board of Education, and I would go to that. And there was the thing called the Jewish Deputies, Jewish Board of Deputies, which was like the equivalent of the Jewish Ministry of the Interior, as opposed to the Zionist Federation, which was the Jewish, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, if you like, right, with Israel. And it was a gathering of all the Jewish leaders, and I got up and I made a speech. I was this nobody, students, and they were all these mature leaders. And I said, we're not protesting enough. I said, this is wrong. I said, we're going to pay the price. I said, this is not going to last, right? And the blacks are going to remember that we didn't stand up and speak out for them. And from every point of view, right, a moral, ethical, and practical view, we need to speak out. Unfortunately, there was I got some encouragement to make that speech by the head of the Jewish Board of Deputies, a very interesting man who nurtured and helped me along. You could not live in South Africa and not be a part of the system, okay? You couldn't say, well, we won't hire a maid, right? We're not going to be a part of the system, because if you didn't hire that maid, she was going to be without work. She was going to, right? So you had to be a part of the system, but you could be a part of the system in as nurturing a way as possible. For example, my father, who's a doctor, established, besides his white clinic, he established a black clinic in another part of town. The blacks were not allowed to live where the whites were. And so he started treating these patients, and he gave them all a reduced price. But then he realized that none of them had money to buy medicines. So he would treat and he would prescribe, and nothing would happen. So he started ordering directly from the pharmaceutical companies. I remember going to the black clinic, and he'd have these huge vats, and I say, "What's that?" Like it'd be like a 6-gallon thing, and he'd say, "Oh, that's cough mixture." And what's that vat, right? He had these huge vats of all these different medicines, and he would just dispense everything for free. I had tremendous example from my parents and the way that they reacted to it. Once again, they employed the maid and they employed the gardener, and and they also had to be a part of the system. But they showed how you could be compassionate within that system. I knew that I was not going to stay in South Africa post-apartheid because I just didn't feel that South Africa had a future, and I always wanted to live in Israel from a very young age.
Why?
Why did I want to live in Israel? Well,
was it from your parents, grandparents? Where did it come from?
To some degree, it was. Look, I remember in South Africa, everybody had a blue box in those days. The blue box was the Keren Kayemet, the JNF, and you used to put coins into this JNF collection box. That was your charity box. Okay, there weren't other charity boxes in those days. And I remember that there was the annual campaign for Israel. And the one thing that would ever get my father really upset was if a guy who had money didn't give what he thought was enough to Israel. Like he would come home so upset, right? It was like, for him, it was like an act of treachery, right? How could this guy give so little to Israel? I remember the tension in the air. I was very young when the 6-Day War happened. Like it was a gripping atmosphere in our own family and in South African Jewry in general. South African Jewry was known as the most Zionistic community in the world. So there was just this message and this tremendous feeling of it just went together. If you were Jewish, you were Zionistic as well. The two went hand in hand. However you interpreted it. We all, as I pointed out, we all went to youth movement on Sunday, and these youth movements were Zionist youth movements, right? It was just part and parcel of our being Jewish. It wasn't a separate issue.
So it's an example of actually, yes, feeling the pain and trying to help people. And which problem you wanted to address when you continuously, teach yourself and teach others how to teach? So it's a cause. What is your cause? If you summarize, and what was the cause that made you who you are?
Well, I've dedicated most of my adult life to the problem of intermarriage and assimilation, lack of Jewish education in the Jewish world. The Jewish world is hemorrhaging at a massive rate, and I feel that the response of the Jewish world as a whole is very inadequate compared to the problems. There are great individuals who've risen to the challenge, but they remain exceptional individuals. I believe that the scope of the problem and the seriousness of the problem would have required that everybody was, right, from the rabbinic leadership and the lay leadership and the wealthy people. Everybody should have been focusing so much energy and resources to this. So that's certainly what has been that issue which has moved me in my adult life. From the moment that I became aware of it, it gripped me. It really gripped me. And rebuilding the Jewish people, my most satisfying moments have been beginning new communities and new institutions in the former Soviet Union in particular. You know, I've probably visited more cities in Russia than you know, the average person who grew up in Russia. You know, I've been to I don't know, Tula and Saratov and Samara and Perm and Yaroslavl, and it goes on and on. So, you know, I've been to and we started things in those communities from scratch. When I went out to the former Soviet Union, all you could find were synagogues that would pay 10 old men to come every day. And if you would stop paying them, they wouldn't come anymore, you know, to continue the meeting. There was no such thing as a young person belonging to a community. And when I first suggested to the people living there that maybe that's what we should be doing, they just thought I was off the wall. They just thought I just didn't understand the limitations of what we were involved with. And out of nowhere, right? Out of nowhere, tens of thousands of young Jewish people in the former Soviet Union, all over, right? You know, in Belarus and in the Ukraine and, you know, and in Latvia and in Russia and in Georgia and, you know, everywhere. Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan, all over. They came to the moment things were provided for them. They came out of the woodwork. So I saw that you could do things, and the more I saw that you could do things, the more that I saw that this was not a hopeless cause. That in fact, these people were just, most of them had never heard a single shir in their life. How were they supposed to think positively about Judaism? They never even heard one single shir. Okay, so the more passionate I became about wanting to empower them. I've always been about empowering others, right? You know, I've always been about nurturing at every level, nurturing leadership at the top levels, and nurturing people coming through the door. Right? I never want to be in a position where I'm holding anything for myself. Okay, if I have a situation where I understand something and how to do it, my instinct is, who can I share this with? Who can I empower with this knowledge? Who can I empower with this skill set? How, you know, and if anybody, I've never felt insecure about holding on to my position or whatever. I've always felt there's so many opportunities to serve God and his Torah and his Jewish people that if it's not this opportunity, it'll be another opportunity. And therefore I've always maximized the idea of my giving over whatever I could to other people and empowering them.
What a story. Rabbi Edelstein, I want to thank you tremendously for your time and sharing your story. Also, I want to extend my blessings, my brachas to you and your family. May Hashem give you courage and wisdom. Amen. Whatever the order, you need wisdom and courage and abilities and resources to continue your journey and empower many, many more people that, as you said, the challenges of today are equally important. And, you know, with your guidance, Hashem's help, we will prevail. Thank you so much.